I became a Christian in 1987. Even though at age 7 I felt my heart strangely warmed and gave my life to Jesus as Lord and Savior, and at 16 accepted God's call upon my life to become a pastor. In fact, in 1987 I was already a pastor, 21 years old, crazy for these two congregations in rural South Dakota, which sounds odd, right, to say I became a Christian while serving as a pastor and preparing to attend seminary that fall. Obviously, there's a story behind that. So in 1987, I went with a group of United Methodist college students from across South Dakota on a mission trip to Haiti. We piled in the back of a brightly painted pickup truck that hugged precipitous cliffs as we climbed steep mountainsides, passing women and children carrying huge baskets on their heads. We passed through rivers without bridges. And hours later, we finally drove on a footpath that ended at a clearing in the woods where there was a small cinder block Methodist church surrounded by huts made of clay and covered with palm branches for roofs. The only other permanent building in that village or that area was a new cinder block school that a previous Methodist mission had built. And we were there to add a kitchen. Unfortunately, it didn't get built. The building supplies, ordered well in advance, didn't arrive until the day before we left. And for 2 weeks, we asked anxiously, when will the supplies arrive? And they always laughed and said, when God provides. We were there to do God's work, to be God's hands, and didn't God want us to get our work done? It was hard to waste time. But of course, we know it was not wasted. Instead, we spent our time playing with kids, learning their games, teaching them our games like Red Rover, Red Rover. The kids were fascinated by my increasingly sunburned skin. And they discovered that if you pressed hard enough on my pink skin, it momentarily turns white until eventually it turns black and blue. Thanks to an interpreter, during the day, we spent a lot of time listening to people tell their stories. And at night, we joined them at the church full of people singing joyously, praising God completely out of proportion to the evidence of blessing we saw with American eyes. But first, today's gospel lesson. Very familiar, calling of Jesus' first disciples. And you may not realize that Luke's version of this familiar story is actually quite different from Matthew and Mark, where there Jesus simply walked by Peter and Andrew and then James and John and said, "Come follow me," and they did. Only Luke adds the drama of fishing all night long with nothing to show for it, and then this miraculous catch, after which Luke explained, then they dropped everything to follow Jesus. And oddly, this story, John tells the same story of a miraculous catch, but it happens after his resurrection, not as the calling of his first disciples. So anyway, there's one particular line in Luke's story that caught my attention. Jesus said to Simon, "Row out farther into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch." They did, and that catch was overwhelming. But again, not until after they rowed out into deep water. Something about that line spoke to me. And so my conversion to Christianity didn't happen in a flash of guilt or grief. There was no crying at an altar at which I stood convicted of my sin. No date and time at which the heavens opened and I finally saw the light. But rather, I slowly, gradually converted to Christianity by the stories the adults told us of their lives. Many stories in which they insisted that when we returned to the United States, we should tell people in our government to make their lives better. As you see, one story after another involved the effects of mangled U.S. foreign policy and how they wanted justice from our government. And I listened. I sympathized. I was just there to do good. My duty, my Christian duty. What they were asking for was political, and politics wasn't my duty. Helping them the way I thought they should be helped. Now, I hate to admit that in my early 20s, I agreed with the critics of Martin Luther King. That you stick to the proper concerns of a Christian minister, you take care of souls. Although I did agree Jesus commanded us to also feed people's bodies. But it's in the same vein of this criticism that Brazilian Archbishop Dom Helder Câmara is famously quoted saying, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist." And why indeed are the Haitians so poor? So here's a little Black History Month lesson. Haiti was the first independent black republic in the Western Hemisphere. A remarkable achievement in 1804, just less than 20 years after the end of the American Revolutionary War. Haitian independence started with a slave rebellion that lasted 12 years until they defeated the forces of none other than Napoleon. France had reaped enormous wealth by importing unprecedented numbers of Africans to grow sugar and coffee. Incredible wealth poured out from the island. Upon Napoleon's defeat, France had the nerve to demand reparations. Imagine the audacity, the absurdity of a country that had grown rich off enslaving people, demanding those people pay for their freedom. And such an enormous amount of money, it took them 143 years to pay it off. The debt was just crushing. In 1900, 80% of Haiti's national budget was still spent paying those reparations, which meant they had virtually no money to spend on infrastructures such as roads and schools and any other human development. And then in 1915, the U.S. used dubious rationale to begin an occupation of Haiti that lasted 20 years. And then in the 1950s, concerned that communism might come to the island, the U.S. began propping up corrupt leaders including the infamous Duvaliers, Papa Doc, Baby Doc. And so our team of Methodist college students arrived in 1987, the year after Baby Doc was finally overthrown and then took nearly all the country's wealth with him. But it started with being the only country in which ex-slaves themselves were expected to pay a foreign government for their own liberty. And after all that these villagers had been through, they were right to expect more from us. I mean, when else would they have the opportunity to speak to Americans who have direct connections to the government in Washington, D.C.? Of course, we all thought, we don't have that kind of access. But then realized, oh my goodness, we do. With elections and elected representatives in our democracy. But I went to Haiti to do good. That was enough, wasn't it? And then, darn it, Jesus said, now row out farther into deeper water. Today, the time to choose whether to stay in the shallows or go toward the deeper waters has come for all of us. Time that the Christian faith is either relevant to the world or not. Some Christian groups have been granted extraordinary access to the new administration, while others have been on the increasing end of unprecedented attacks. For all the talk of religious liberty, Diana Butler Bass describes watching selective religious freedom play out. For example, with absolutely no evidence, no merit, Elon Musk has accused Lutherans of fraud. Lutherans, of all people. Those folks in Lake Wobegon. They called it money laundering, to be exact, and said he will shut down illegal payments for their work running nursing homes and foster care and food programs and so much more. Examine them all and shut them down, labeling Lutherans of running a snake oil organization. Whether or not he actually does, creating the fear of it has worked. Episcopal Migration Ministry, among others, has let go of all their employees. Priests have been racially profiled. Bishops denounced by members of Congress. Quakers suing, citing hindrances to their religious liberty. The evangelical organization World Vision carries out a significant number of projects for USAID, all at risk. Haitian food programs, among those eliminated, or maybe they won't be. Last week, the Vice President himself insulted the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, said, look in the mirror a little bit and recognize when you receive over $100 million to resettle illegal immigrants, which is his words, not the truth, are you more worried about humanitarian concerns or are you actually worried about your bottom line? Mormons issued a rare public statement, as close to a rebuke as you can get from Mormons, about the mass deportations underway, remembering the last time children were separated from their families, saying, we are especially concerned about keeping families together. And in response to all these unprecedented attacks, the head of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, recounted the story of St. Lawrence, a deacon in the ancient church. The Roman emperor demanded the Christian church turn over its riches, but instead, Lawrence sold all the possessions of the church and gave the money to the poor. And when the emperor confronted him and demanded his money, Lawrence pointed to the hungry, the poor, the naked, the stranger in the land, the most vulnerable, and declared, these are the treasures of the church. And for that, St. Lawrence was executed. And Bishop Eaton concluded, be of good courage, church, and let us persevere. Can you imagine we're here? I wish this was all hyperbole. I wish I wasn't talking about this again. But Christian friends, in response, Jesus is calling to us, row out a little further into deeper water and recognize that loving our trans children and grandchildren is now political. And preaching about mercy is now political. And displaying a sign or a flag that explicitly welcomes everyone is now political. Hosting a Spanish-speaking church is now political. And hiring a pastor of color is now political. And having a woman preach from the pulpit is now political. And believing in empathy is now political. Loving your neighbor as yourself, political. And when I give food to the poor, they'll call me a saint. And when I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist. Because yes, now feeding hungry people around the world is political too. So it's time, friends, to row out a little farther into deeper water beyond our comfort, because you see, surface Christianity, shallow Christianity in these times is not enough. And I sympathize. You may not want to hear this difficult news in church, and of course, then we'd also have to stop reading the Bible, but I truly sympathize. But you see, I converted to Christianity in 1987, and I can't help myself. I hear Jesus calling. Please, won't you also give your life to Christ? Those words just mean something so different, because the time for that to be real is now. As the hymn says, now is the time for wisdom and courage, for the facing of this hour. God of grace and God of glory, from the evils that surround us and assail our Savior's ways, from the fears that have long bound us, free our hearts for faith and praise. Harry Emerson Fosdick, 1930. God of grace and God of glory, save us from weak resignation to evils we deplore. Let the search for your salvation be our glory forevermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. And the people say,